pleasure to be here. I've been fortunate to attend all of the CARE conferences, and I have never left one without learning something that affected my teaching, that didn't affect my research. These have been certainly an enjoyable educational experience for me, and I'm thrilled to be here with all of you. Now, you might wonder why an accountant would get interested in hurricanes. This actually started as I was trying to collect a sample of supply chain disruption announcements, and there was seemed like a serious lack of announcements by oil and gas firms. And you're like, oh, I know there's hurricanes, they're in the Gulf of Mexico. Why am I looking at major hurricane time periods that I'm not finding anything on these major oil companies? And that kind of led to this particular study. What do we kind of find? Well, we find that the major oil companies experience significant negative abnormal returns of about 0.5% 1 day before major Gulf hurricanes reach land, and reach land within the primary oil and gas production region of the Gulf. We find that these abnormal returns occur before any firm announcement of damage to facilities or how much lost production there is. We also find that these abnormal returns vary quite significantly with the oil price variability. Periods in which oil prices are more variable, these abnormal returns are greater. We also find that these abnormal returns are significantly different from returns to minor Gulf Coast hurricanes that land in the same region, and they're also different from major hurricanes that never really threaten the oil and gas region. And lastly, we were unable to find any significant abnormal returns to the minor hurricanes at all. So, again, why did we get interested in this? Well, we've certainly established in our literature that when there are delays or the financial accounting system fails to report entirely value-relevant information, the market goes elsewhere, and it starts looking for its own sources of information. Certainly our accounting valuation models try to focus our attention on operations, and certainly there have been recent studies that try to show that supply chain disruption announcements lead to abnormal returns. They tend to say supply chain, we tend to say operations. To me, they're virtually the same. Excuse me. So what we're trying to do here is to figure out, should the financial reporting environment provide better disclosures? Should they provide more timely disclosures of these possible things? Or should we just let the market go ahead and make their own assessments of what these things should be? So we decided to, first, what hurricanes to look at. And we decided, looking at this hurricane scale from the National Hurricane Center, of course, the types of hurricanes and the types of destruction that typically came with these hurricanes, and the minor hurricanes being categories 1 and 2, the major hurricanes being categories 3, 4, and 5. And from looking at these things that I have highlighted in green and red, we decided that, well, you really wouldn't expect much to happen with a category 1 or 2 hurricane, and so we should probably center our attention on the major hurricanes, 3, 4, and 5. And here they are since 1961, where we start having data available to us through 2005. A couple of interesting things here. First of all, the number of days that the hurricane is in the Gulf of Mexico. Roughly about 3 days. And so by the time the hurricane either develops in the Gulf or that it comes into the Gulf as a storm, there's about a 3-day lag before it hits land. The categories of these hurricanes, of course, Camille being the only category 5 to strike. There are really only 3, 4 category 4s. All the rest are category 3s. And I've got listed here the firms we've used in our portfolio. What we did here was so few events, we wanted to try to limit the amount of noise that was involved. And so I painstakingly checked all of the oil and gas firms that I could and made sure that they all had a presence in the Gulf, either refineries, terminals, something, because I did not want to be adding in firms into the sample that did not have a presence in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, we heard that the forecast accuracy of Oklahoma rivers hasn't improved too much. Well, here's the National Hurricane Center, and these are Atlantic-facing tropical storms and hurricanes, and this is their accuracy over time from, 1970 to about 2008. The red are their 24-hour ahead forecasts. The green, their 48-hour ahead forecasts, and the yellow, 72. And if we use, 1990, just as kind of an easy point to keep in mind, their 72-hour ahead forecasts were roughly 350, this is nautical miles, about 350 to 400 statute miles. Their 48-hour ahead forecasts were about 200 to 250 miles off. And obviously their 24-hour ahead forecasts were 110 to 120, somewhere in that range. Obviously, have they improved their forecasting over time? Quite dramatically, would appear. Something else that's kind of noticeable is in these later years, the variance of their errors has dropped tremendously. That's certainly noticeable. Whereas in these earlier years, boy, they were, I'm not going to say hit or miss, because we all know forecasting is a tough business, but certainly they have improved dramatically. One other thing, I guess, that's at least interesting to me in this, well, let me go to the map real quick. It's easier to look here. Here's a map of the Gulf Coast, and this map has kind of been smirched a little bit. It's not so accurate, but this distance between New Orleans to Apalachicola is about 200 statute miles, give or take. And the distance between New Orleans and Lake Charles, that distance is really about 100 miles. This distance south from New Orleans down to, in here, about Corpus Christi or so, that's another roughly 200 miles, something of that nature. And so these major hurricanes, if we're 200 miles off 48 hours before, well, we're already outside this primary oil and gas region. The hurricane could be headed toward New Orleans, and before you know it, it's ended up over here in Apalachicola. And so that more or less said to us that their forecast accuracy over much of this time period would make you think that, 48 hours ahead, they may not be so good, not so accurate, but when they get to within approximately 24 hours, their accuracy improves dramatically. And so we started thinking that maybe we should see a reaction, if we were going to find one, somewhere around -1, 0, somewhere around there. We chose landfall as our 0 because these storms are all so different. Some form in the Gulf, some move into the Gulf. Andrew crossed the Florida Peninsula and entered the Gulf. There was just no common way to track these storms because they were all so different. And so we decided to use landfall as the common point and back up from there, is what we did. This oil and gas corridor, I'm sure most of you realize that there's a shelf out here in the Gulf of Mexico, and most of the oil production has been inside on that shelf for many years. And recently now, the oil companies are starting to talk and do deep water drilling. They're moving off of that shelf and looking for oil in deeper water. We got all kinds of maps and things to see the location of oil leases, production facilities. This region between Corpus Christi, really Galveston to New Orleans, is ringed with refineries. This region, this oil and gas corridor, obviously there are pipelines that are just web-like all through this region that these oil platforms use to transport oil. And we wanted to try to use the location of the hurricane to maybe help explain what kind of abnormal returns we found. We initially wanted to try to look at more or less the center of this corridor, but there's only so much you can expect 21 observations to do for you. And so our primary test turned into comparing the hurricanes that land outside the corridor or don't threaten the corridor to those that have. Here's an example of things we were reading from the National Hurricane Center. This is about Hurricane Camille. A couple of interesting things here. First, with Hurricane Camille, it says that early on the Sunday morning, the 17th, which just happens to also be when Hurricane Camille landed, midnight on the 17th. It was about 250 miles south of Mobile. There were hurricane warnings up. It took a few hours before those hurricane warnings were actually extended to the Mississippi coast. And by then the hurricane was within 200 miles or so. Once again, saying to us that it's quite possible that any reaction to these storms would occur quite late. Another interesting thing here that I have in green is that there was an offshore drilling rig that was raked by 170 miles per hour winds. And I think it's difficult for a human to stand up in winds of about 80 to 100. And the oil rig was being raked 170 miles per hour. Interesting. Now here's another problem we faced. The day of the landfall. We can't tell the hurricanes to stop. It's a Sunday, markets are closed, you have to wait till Monday. And so we had to start thinking in terms of what effect would a weekend landfall potentially have on our results. And as I've tried to illustrate here, you know, the calendar days and the crisp days can be quite different. A Sunday landfall, well, I'm going to have to rely on Monday returns, and that's going to be my day zero, if you will. And I can't use Saturday as my day -1. I'm going to have to back up to Friday and look at returns to Friday before. And so a hurricane that would land on Wednesday, I don't have this same problem. And so I potentially have a problem with when the hurricane reached land. And down here I have the 21 hurricanes listed, the day of their landfall and so forth. The ones inside our oil and gas corridor, the ones outside. You can see that we had 9 that seemed to be pretty clean hurricanes, so to speak, because we don't have this day of the week problem. And there were 7 where we had potentially a problem with looking at their abnormal returns. Another issue that we discovered as we were doing this, 2 of the hurricanes, we had a confounding event. The Wall Street Journal came out with some news stories in which they were claiming the oil industry would have increased profits. They mentioned several of the firms in our sample. And so with this confounding event, we had to keep that in mind and try to design some tests with that in mind to try to control for it in some way, shape, or form. And so here's the abnormal returns we found. These are for the least noisy sample. It's the 7 major hurricanes with landfalls in the oil and gas region. I've eliminated both the Alicia and Opal hurricanes and those on Sundays and Mondays. And we find a negative 0.63% abnormal return 1 day before landfall. Almost an identical number days 1 minus 0, and our market adjusted returns are similar as well. Well, let's add some noise. And so I'm picking up 10 hurricanes now. The Monday hurricanes, well, maybe maybe I get a good day 0 effect, even though my day -1 effect isn't so good. And so I've added 3 more hurricanes. Of course, my percent air starts to drop as I add more noise. I get more significance, probably due to the fact that I'm increasing the sample size a little bit. And again, things seem pretty much the same. And here are the noisiest sample I have, 14 of the major hurricanes in the oil and gas corridor, and I'm still able to pick up significant abnormal returns, day -1 and 0, for this oil and gas portfolio. So what would I expect if I tried to run some regressions on these abnormal returns? Well, I'd like to be able to differentiate the abnormal returns for the hurricanes within the corridor from those outside the corridor. I'd like to show a relationship between the abnormal returns and oil price volatility. And last but not least, if possible, I'd like to differentiate the abnormal returns from the major hurricanes from the minor hurricanes, is what we're going to try to do. Why oil price volatility? You know, it's been kind of an intuitively appealing idea that you would think stock prices should follow oil prices in our economy. For many, many years, a lot of people have tried to show a relationship. It's been difficult to do. I believe part of the reason is because since about 1940 through about 1970, there's virtually no volatility in oil prices. You can go for years and years and years, and the index on oil prices doesn't change a nickel. And so that could have been part of the reason early studies had trouble. Of late, there was a JFE paper, I want to say in 2008, where someone finally showed that across many economies, they could actually find an association of oil prices to abnormal returns to a stock index portfolio after controlling for our typical variables, the market and so forth. Well, let's see what kind of regressions we're going to try. The top one here is the most important one, really. I'm putting in a variable for the news on these 2 hurricanes that I hope to try to control for. That way I can include them. I've put oil price volatility in this regression. And then I've put oil price volatility in again, and I'm multiplying it by a dummy variable for if the hurricane hits land within the oil and gas corridor. I'm trying again over here to see if there's a day of the week effect. Do I see a larger reaction if the hurricane comes ashore during the week as opposed to a weekend? And I'm measuring oil price volatility with the producer price index because there's more volatility in it than in other indexes, and I only had to use 30 months in order to get some volatility at all. During the 1960s, it's just, oil prices just do not move whatsoever, as many of us would know, because we're old and we remember those days. What do we find? Well, here's our 21 major hurricanes. We're able to pick up a significant day 1 effect to our Wall Street Journal stories, claiming that the oil companies are going to start doing well. Interestingly enough, the market seems to be efficient. By day 0, the impact of those stories has disappeared. I take great heart in that. We're not able to pick up any significant effect to oil price volatility unless we look at the hurricanes that come into the oil and gas corridor. And then we're able to pick up a negative reaction. We get a negative effect on the day of the week, meaning the hurricanes that come to shore during the week, they're a little more negative, they're abnormal returns, but I'm just not able to find much significance. We get a pretty good R squared. Well, with 21 events, you would hope you could do pretty good. Other interesting things here, right? might be on day zero, once the major hurricanes have been priced by the market, if you will, well, things kind of go back to normal. There's an oil price volatility effect in the market. The corridor effect has basically zeroed out. We're not explaining nearly as much of the abnormal returns as we do with a model that was designed to explain day minus one abnormal returns. And so that's not too surprising either. We also looked post 73, post the oil embargo. And everything stays pretty true to form. Again, the Wall Street Journal story falls out after one day. That certainly is interesting. The oil price volatility, not much action, not much change. We've lost some significance, but we're still explaining a pretty fair percent of the abnormal returns. What about the minor hurricanes? And I just completed this a few short weeks ago. Well, there were 27 of them. 23 of the minor hurricanes had landfalls within the oil and gas corridor. As I said earlier, I was not able to find any significant abnormal returns. It kind of appeared that the market reaction was about half, 60% of what the market reaction was to the large major hurricanes. The reaction appeared to be later, perhaps day zero, perhaps day 0 plus 1. And I don't have as much of a problem with the weekend effect with these minor hurricanes. Many, many more, a higher percentage, are occurring on Tuesday through Saturdays as opposed to on the weekend. I did have one issue with one minor hurricane, Dolly. There was a major Senate vote on a windfall profits tax on the oil companies the same day as the hurricane reached land. So what do I find here with all of the hurricanes? I've tried to add a variable to this regression for the major hurricanes to try to differentiate them from all of the hurricanes coming into the corridor and from the hurricanes that did not get to the corridor. I'm trying to differentiate three groups, if you will. Again, my Wall Street Journal story is working like I'd hope. I can't find much of a reaction to the oil price volatility variable. I don't get much of a reaction on day minus one for all of the hurricanes hitting the corridor, but I am once again finding a significant reaction for the major hurricanes. What troubles me is when I come over here to day zero, suddenly, boy, I'm getting a huge negative coefficient there, a huge positive coefficient here, and this just looks very suspicious to me. I think there's a lot of collinearity going on here that's driving this variable down, this variable up. And so what I tried to do to try to control for that a little bit is I went to just the hurricanes with landfalls in the oil and gas corridor. And let's just compare the major hurricanes to the minor hurricanes. And I get some regressions that look a lot more like I would suspect. Again, the Wall Street Journal story, an effect day minus one, no effect on day zero. My oil price volatility is now showing some significance on day minus one, kind of the non-event period, if you will, for the minor hurricanes. The major hurricanes, I'm showing a negative reaction on day minus one. Day zero rolls around and I start to pick up some negative reaction, which is what I would expect. It's less of a reaction than I see for the major hurricanes. I would kind of suspect that too, given the size of these abnormal returns. And adding noise, of course, has driven all my R-squareds down. And so I guess what I would hope you would be willing to accept were my original conclusions here. Where are we at here? That I'm able to find some significant abnormal returns to these hurricanes for these major oil companies. That these abnormal returns are occurring, and you might say 0.55 is kind of small. Well, yeah, it is, but there's been no firm announcement This is the market making projections on its own. No information from the firm specifically, that they vary in size with oil price volatility, and that I've been able to document a difference between the effect of major and minor hurricanes to these oil and gas companies. So, that's all I have. Thank you so much.
Again, we have time for a few short questions, and if you have a question, please use one of the microphones at the side.
I know you have the oil majors in there. Are there other firms which do not have operations in this area? So could you find a portfolio of firms that don't operate in this area that would give you some sort of contemporaneous control?
Boy, I would sure like to. But that's a little harder to prove positively, right? And some of the firms that you know just do not, like let's take China, PetroChina.
Right, or Occidental or some, not Occidental, but the European one, ENI or whatever.
Total.
Total.
Things of this nature.
Yeah.
South American oil companies, Canadian oil companies that are primarily in the oil sand region. I would sure like to, but going back to 1961, that becomes kind of a problem. Because a lot of these firms aren't traded on the New York Stock Exchange or anywhere that I have data available to me during much of this time period. A lot of these companies are new to our exchanges. And so for some of the time period, I probably could, but I'm not sure it would be long enough to really matter so much. I don't know them.
And are there any reversals? So once this happens, and are you able to track that, or you don't have that fineness of data?
Reversals, you mean in the abnormal returns?
Right, because then if it doesn't happen, right?
It it's interesting. Depending on how you slice these hurricanes, this day of the week is more of a problem than you might suspect. Depending on how you slice it and which hurricanes you kind of look at, there does appear to be kind of a reversal, say day +1.
I see.
But it depends on how you're looking at it.
Well, that would be useful to note, because one of the things with the information leakage literature, and we find this in some other studies that we've done, is that it should be documented that when bad news doesn't happen, there are channels other than announcements. I mean, one of the things you're talking about is that this is public information.
Absolutely.
Markets should react to public information, right? But when it doesn't happen, people can pick up the phone, call around, and that information might leach into prices in a way that you and I as researchers would never be able to pick up. So that's what I was trying to get at.
And the reason I don't have those listed here is because most of them for our sample kind of fell right outside this 5% level. But do I believe there are some reversals going on? I certainly do.
Thank you.
And within your portfolios and within the firms that you're studying, there would probably be considerable heterogeneity in the size of their operations within the Gulf. For Exxon, they may have a very small percentage of their operations that are going to be affected by the impacts of the hurricanes within the Gulf. They're very widely diversified, and for some companies, if you have a rig company that's in there, it could be much more detrimental to them. Do you sort on anything, try to see whether or not the companies that were going to have the highest exposure in terms of their earnings or potential disruption are actually having the bigger type of reactions?
I'd sure like to. But again, I just don't have a way to do that. I'm just not able to find detailed enough data, particularly for the early years of this sample, 61, 64, to be able to do that consistently. The later years, yes, I would be more likely to be able to classify the firms into those with a lot of concentration, those with less. But for the early years, I just am not able to. But I would like, the reason we used cars here instead of running these as portfolio abnormal returns is for exactly this reason. We were hoping to try to be able to differentiate the firm dependence on the Gulf.
This is sort of a follow-on to that question. I was wondering if you could speculate on what you think the mechanism might be for this relationship.
The mechanism, what do you mean?
Meaning,
the pricing mechanism?
Well,
or?
he was suggesting that it may be the possible exposure to offshore rigs to hurricanes and incurring losses because of that. But I was wondering if there were, I mean, you've thought about this a lot, obviously, and I was wondering if you had any speculations as to what really may be driving this correlation.
Boy, I really don't. I wish I had more intuition. I just don't have a lot of data to be able to look empirically at this. Sometimes the firms barely mention that they even have anything going on in the Gulf. And I look through information sources, I look through company histories, I look through annual reports. I did a lot of searching to be able to verify that they had anything there at all. And exactly, does it pertain to pipelines or does it pertain to oil rigs? I just do not have enough detailed data to really be able to say much about that.
One other thing, I really liked the graph that you showed. I thought it was very
The forecasting?
very encouraging. Yeah, the forecasting graph. I thought that was very encouraging. So
You know, that is encouraging.
yeah.
And the fact that
The USGS would be very
as
envious.
Professor showed us, 2005, the number of hurricanes is increasing like wild now, and the fact that their accuracy has increased tremendously, this is very encouraging.
So this is a forecast of actual storm tracks, so location of storm tracks.
Absolutely.
Right.
And this is all hurricanes, this is all tropical storms. This is storm tracks out in the middle of the Atlantic. I don't have specific data from the National Hurricane Center about just hurricanes or Gulf hurricanes. This is their averages for all of these.
Yeah, my guess is that this has a lot to do with the increased number of weather satellites tasked to
Perhaps.
monitor this.
I think it also has to do with the fact that the number of different forecasting models they are using now compared to what they used in 1970 has increased tremendously. And the types of forecasting models they are, many more types of qualitative models and things of this nature. You know, we all understand that different types of forecasts averaged together are going to give us better forecasts than one particular kind of a forecast model. And they certainly are proof of that they are now using all kinds of different kinds of forecasting models.
Do you know if the way that this was done, I had one small experience in Melbourne, Australia, actually, at the BMRC, Bureau of Meteorological Research Center, where, I had the good fortune to actually sit on one of the daily weather forecasting sessions where they put out the national forecast. And I was quite surprised that it was basically a meeting of about a half a dozen people and one guy who's the boss. And each person would sort of give their view. The boss would kind of sit there and listen to it all. And he'd say, I think it's going to be.
And you know, and again, what I like, I certainly would have loved to try to take advantage of this and to use the fact that they're doing a much better job now as far as where to look for, where the market would be expecting something to happen. And again, with such a small sample, I just am not able to get down to that kind of detail. I just don't have enough observations. But certainly this is, if I was living on the Gulf Coast, this might have something to do with the fact that more and more people are willing to put more at risk because the National Hurricane Center now, more than ever before, can give you a much better idea of where the darn hurricane is going to go.
All right, we'll